Okay. Since I'm using the ChatGPT 3.5, it doesn't have data beyond September 2021. So $100 in 1985 would have been 246 now. So that half a trillion then is worth 1.25 trillion now, roughly speaking. Even then, half a trillion was a lot of money. Now, if these guys were actually using short-term interest rate futures, they could have actually hedged their exposure. And trading on these kind of started in the 90s, partly motivated by savings and loan kind of debacle. One thing I need to warn you about, if you're managing interest rate risk of or funding risk of long-term assets with short-term futures, I will give you the cautionary story of an old German firm that's now defunct called Deutsche Metallgesellschaft, which is English for German metal company, something like that. Gesellschaft, you can think of it as society, company. Some of you may or may not know, after the 1973 Arab-Israel War, which was also known as the Yom Kippur War, and America kind of sided with Israel. A lot of Arab OPEC countries started embargo on United States, which means they would not sell crude oil to United States. Of course, you know, market being market, some people started coming up with solutions. Deutsche Metallgesellschaft was one of these companies. These embargo countries did not have any beef with Germany, so they actually were selling crude oil to German companies. What Deutsche Metallgesellschaft did, okay, they said, we'll buy the oil from the Gulf countries, and they started selling long-term contracts to different countries, including US corporations. They said, over the next 10 years, I'm going to sell you, I don't know, 10 million barrels a year at this price, fixed price. They obviously knew that there was a risk of oil prices going up, so they had no delusions about that. They figured we'll hedge this risk using the oil futures, which were in existence then. And they went ahead and did it. And let's think of their position. Their natural position is fixed oil prices, right? If the oil prices go up, they have to pay a higher price to source that oil, because crude oil is not something that you can buy now and store for hundreds of years. You can, but that storage also costs money. And there is also a finite limit on how much you could store. That actually led to the first ever long squeeze back in early COVID days, which I'll come to. Which means your natural position when it comes to oil is short. If oil prices go down, you benefit from it. You are sourcing your supply obligations at a low rate, which meant to hedge this exposure, you establish long position in crude oils. So if oil prices go up, you pay higher price to source that oil because you sold it at a fixed value. So you make less money. But since you have long position in the oil futures, you make more money. So you're hedged. Nothing wrong with that. They actually did the right thing and hedged themselves. But here's the problem. futures contracts are short-term. Typically on crude oil, anything beyond 3 months doesn't trade much. You can actually see it. Crude oil CME. Let's look at volume and an open interest. There is a lot of open interest in December contract, some in January, and it kind of goes down after that. In terms of volume, most of the volume is in November, December, and January contracts. So for practical purposes, you use the short-term contracts as your position changes, just like we did for transaction exposure hedging. You keep rolling it. Again, mechanically, there is no problem with that. But remember the way futures exchanges work. They have daily settlement. So if oil prices are going down, okay, that means you have fixed long-term contracts. You know you're gonna source the oil at lower value in the future, but your long contracts are losing money. Every day exchange is gonna come to you and say, you lost this much money today, pay me. You lost this much money today, pay me. From an accounting viewpoint, because of your long-term assets, you actually didn't lose any money, or from an economic point of view. But your actual cash flow is very different, because cash flow from the future long-term assets has not materialized yet. And starting 1982, oil prices started tanking big time. By late 80s, they were trading probably around $8-10 a barrel. Do you really think that Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait just because he was crazy? He was making less and less money from oil, so he said, "Oh, I got some, free resources over there. Let me go get it." If you thought that otherwise, you don't know anything, right? Almost all wars are economic, including the Crusades. Crusades didn't happen because suddenly Pope was angry that Jerusalem was in the hands of the Muslims. Jerusalem was in the hands of Muslims since 10 years after Prophet Muhammad died. So it wasn't a new thing. But, Dark Ages, Middle Ages, Europe was very poor. And in the meantime, the Islamic civilization was thriving, which means they had money. Well, these people don't have money, these people have money. What do? You go declare a war on them, get their money. That's the way the world works. Even now, we just don't call it a war. We get their money in different ways. I know of only one war that had nothing to do with money. And obviously it had to do with football, not the American kind. There was a game between El Salvador and Honduras. I think this was either late 70s or early 80s. There was a big time fight in the stands, and that actually caused a war between two countries. A lot of people died in that game. What happened to Deutsche Metallgesellschaft? The cash flow cost of hedging those long-term contracts became untenable. Technically speaking, you can borrow money to finance it, but A, interest rates were high anyway, and B, I'm a bank and I'm looking at it. I'm going to call it DMG, the EMG has a contract to sell 10 million barrels of oil to, let's say, Central African Republic. Okay? What guarantees are there that Central African Republic is going to honor that contract if the oil prices in the market are $10, but they're obligated to pay $40 because of the contract? The chances are probably not much. In any case, by the time the contract time comes, probably there's a new dictator in that country that's not going to recognize any of that. So as a bank, I'm not going to see that contract as a good collateral. So they ended up going bankrupt, even though they made no mistake, technically speaking. Their mistake was they hedged their exposure using short-term instruments that created cash flow issues instead of a long-term instrument. So if you're a bank and you have, let's say, a big T-bond portfolio, if short-term interest rates go up, typically yields on those T-bonds also go up, which means their value is going to go down. Okay, you can hedge that using 3-month interest rate futures contracts. But if things go the other way around, even though your bond portfolio is making good money, you're going to lose a lot of money on the futures part of the hedge, which may create a funding issue for you. You may have to use your business credit lines to be able to fund that. That's why we're going to look at later in the semester something called interest rate swaps, fixed to floating. It's a civilized way of hedging interest rate exposure. You can read all of that. You could read the rest of the stuff from the book. You don't need me for that. Okay, let's stop here for today. On Monday, let me see what we have coming up. Chapter 12. Why is this thing so slow? Actually, I'm going to go ahead and start talking about interest rate swaps, both within a country and cross currency, which can be used to hedge interest rate exposure, or if you borrow in international money market, which happens to be typically floating rate, how can you hedge the risk of that? And you can also hedge the currency risk of such loans as well, right? So we'll start talking about those on Monday. I'll see you guys Monday.